Imagine the cold before you feel it, the quiet before it notices you. Imagine standing at the very edge of the known world, where firelight thins out and the dark stops feeling empty. Tonight, we're going to drift into the story of a tribe so unsettling, so misunderstood, that even Vikings men who burned villages for sport hesitated, turned their ships, and sometimes sailed home in silence rather than face them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me your location and local time down in the comments. There's something quietly comforting about knowing where in the world people are listening from as this story unfolds. Now let your shoulders loosen. Let the day fade. You are standing somewhere in Scandinavia, more than 1,000 years ago. Behind you are farms, longhouses, smoke, and voices. Ahead of you is land that doesn't answer when spoken to. Forests stretch without paths. Snow covers tracks almost as quickly as they're made. The wind moves like it has intentions. This is where the Vikings stop joking. They don't say it openly. Vikings rarely admitted fear the way other people do. Fear was supposed to be wrestled, beaten, or drowned in ale. But this place, this direction was different. You hear it in lowered voices, in jokes that trail off halfway through, in captains who suddenly decide the fishing will be better elsewhere. Because beyond this point live people who do not fight the way fights are supposed to happen. They don't build walls you can burn. They don't gather armies you can count. They don't stay still long enough to be conquered. They are the Sami. And to the Viking mind, they are deeply wrong in the most unsettling way possible. You need to understand something about Vikings to understand this fear. Vikings believed the world was layered, visible and invisible, pressed tightly together. Gods walked nearby. Fate was already written. Dreams mattered. Omens mattered. The wrong bird at the wrong time could decide whether a man lived or died. So when something happened that didn't fit their rules, it didn't get ignored, it got explained. And the explanation was rarely comforting. The Sami lived in places where crops failed, where winters swallowed months of sunlight, where survival itself felt like a negotiation with unseen forces. Yet they survived anyway. Not barely, not desperately. They thrived moving with the seasons, following animals, vanishing and reappearing as if the land itself carried them. To a Viking, that didn't look like skill. It looked like permission. Stories traveled faster than ships. A trader would return speaking about people who left no footprints in fresh snow. A sailor would swear that a storm rose only after angering a Sami man at a shoreline market. A hunter would claim he heard drumming from nowhere, deep in the forest, and felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. Now here's the quirky detail scholars love to argue about. Some Viking sagas describe the Sami as short, hunched, and shadowy, not because they were, but because fear literally altered perception. Modern historians debate whether these descriptions reflect actual encounters or the psychological distortion of outsiders entering unfamiliar environments. That debate never really settles, which somehow makes the stories even better for bedtime. Picture a Viking camp at night. The fire is low, the men are quieter than usual. Someone mentions a rumor just casually that this is Sami land now. No one laughs. Someone else pokes the fire a little harder than necessary. Axes are kept closer, because if you fight another tribe, you know what to do. But if you fight the weather, the forest, the darkness itself, what do you swing at? The Vikings believed these people could see what others couldn't, that they could send their spirits out while their bodies stayed behind, that they could whisper to animals and ask them for guidance. that they knew when strangers were coming days before they arrived. And the scariest part? The Sami didn't deny it. They didn't rush to explain themselves. They didn't correct rumors. They didn't invite reassurance. Silence did that work for them. You start to notice a pattern. The closer Vikings came to these lands, the less brave their stories became. Victories turned vague. Defeats turned mysterious. Entire expeditions vanished from records. Not because they were wiped out, but because they were never attempted. There's a scholarly phrase historians like to use here: cultural asymmetry of power. It sounds boring, but it means something simple when one group measures strength with weapons, and the other measures it with knowledge. Fear flows in strange directions. The Sami understood snow the way sailors understood water. They read wind the way others read maps. They knew how to live without leaving marks, how to take what was needed without announcing it. To Vikings, this felt like being hunted by ghosts, and slowly, quietly, a reputation formed, not through battle cries or banners, but through hesitation, through detours, through warnings muttered to sons and brothers before voyages north. Don't go too far. Don't follow them inland. Don't offend them, because whatever they are, they're not like us. As your breathing deepens, notice how this fear isn't loud. It's not screaming terror. It's the kind that creeps in sideways, that makes strong men suddenly practical, cautious, respectful, in a way they aren't used to being. This section of the world doesn't roar. It waits. And as you drift further into this story, you'll see how that waiting, patient, quiet, misunderstood became the most effective defense a people ever had. The fire crackles lower now. The forest listens. And somewhere beyond the edge of light, something ancient remains completely unbothered by Viking steel. You move further now, not with your feet, but with your attention. The farms are gone. The idea of ownership thins out. Here, the land doesn't feel like something people take. It feels like something that occasionally allows itself to be used. This is where the Sami live, though live might be the wrong word if you're thinking in Viking terms. They don't stay put long enough to be surrounded. They don't carve their names into stone. Their homes rise and disappear with the seasons. Light enough to move, smart enough to survive. To an outsider, it looks temporary. To them, it's precise. Vikings valued permanence. A longhouse meant success. Land cleared meant power. A farm passed down meant a future you could point to. The Sami had none of this, and yet they had everything they needed. Someone to notice you arriving. Instead, you find signs that someone has been, tracks that end suddenly, bones arranged deliberately, tools placed where they shouldn't be. The sense isn't that no one is there. It's that they're choosing not to be visible. That choice alone feels powerful. The Sami dressed differently too. Bright colors against snow. Patterns that meant something to them but nothing to outsiders. Clothing designed for function, warmth, movement, not intimidation. And yet Vikings felt intimidated anyway, because nothing about this people matched the rules Vikings relied on to judge strength. They didn't raid. They didn't boast. They didn't challenge. They observed. Viking culture was loud. Even their gods were loud thunder, war cries, feasting halls. Sami spirituality, from the outside, seemed inward, deliberate, quiet. That silence invited imagination to fill the gaps, and imagination is far crueler than reality. There's a fringe tidbit that floats through old sagas. Some Vikings believed Sami children were born already, knowing things' paths through blizzards, animal movements, even names of spirits. No historian takes that literally, of course, but many agree it reflects something real. Knowledge passed so early and so naturally that outsiders assumed it had to be supernatural. And here's where the fear deepened. The Sami didn't expand. They didn't conquer neighbors. They didn't try to push Vikings away aggressively. That meant there was no clear motive to understand, no hunger for land, no thirst for power. If someone doesn't want what you have, why are they still so confident? In Viking thinking, power always wanted more. Gold wanted to grow. Land wanted to spread. Glory wanted witnesses. A people who didn't chase those things, but still survived, felt unnatural, like a rule breaker in a world built on rules. So rumors layered themselves carefully. The Sami weren't just different. They were aligned with animals, with weather, with forces. Vikings respected but feared to touch directly. The forest seemed to favor them. The cold didn't punish them the same way. You can feel how that perception forms slowly. No single incident, no dramatic confrontation, just repetition. Year after year of uneasy encounters that never turned violent, yet never felt safe either. The Viking solution to danger was action. Attack first, burn it down, take control. But how do you attack a people who don't present themselves as a target? You don't. You go around them, you trade cautiously, you whisper stories to explain your hesitation, and slowly a truth settles in, not spoken aloud but felt. These people don't need to scare us. They already do. The wind shifts softly now, like it's turning a page. The night stretches on, and as you drift deeper, you'll start to see how Viking fear didn't come from weakness, but from recognizing a kind of strength they couldn't use without losing themselves. By now, you've probably noticed something important. This fear didn't come from weakness. It came from the Viking mind doing what it always did, trying to organize the world into threats it could understand. Vikings were not reckless in the way movies make them seem. Yes, they were violent, but it was a structured violence. Raids followed seasons. Targets were chosen carefully. Even berserkers, despite their reputation, operated within social rules. Rage was ritualized. Death had meaning. Fear, on the other hand, was supposed to be useful. A good fear sharpened judgment. It warned you when the gods were displeased, when fate had shifted slightly off its usual course. Vikings paid close attention to those signals. They watched birds before battles. They delayed voyages over bad dreams. They abandoned plans if omens stacked the wrong way. So when fear began clustering around the Sami, it wasn't dismissed. It was analyzed. The problem was that none of the usual categories fit. The Sami didn't raid, so they weren't enemies in the familiar sense. They didn't demand tribute, so they weren't political rivals. They didn't challenge gods directly, so they weren't blasphemers. Yet Viking sagas kept placing them at the edges of maps, stories, and consciousness, always nearby, always strange, always slightly out of sync with normal time. There's a phrase some historians use here, fear of liminality. It means fear of things that exist between categories. Vikings were comfortable with chaos during battle, but they preferred order everywhere else. The Sami lived in between seasons, between places, between worlds, as the Norse imagined them. That unsettled people more than swords ever could. Consider how Vikings thought about fate. Everything important was already decided, but not always visible. The future existed, just out of sight. Seers could glimpse it, but doing so came with risks. Even Odin paid a price for knowledge, an eye for wisdom. Now imagine hearing rumors of a people who seemed to live in that space, who didn't just glimpse fate, but navigated alongside it, who treated uncertainty as home terrain rather than danger. To a Viking, that's not impressive. That's alarming. Here's a quirky tidbit that still sparks debate. Some Norse texts suggest that Sami men could curse weapons so they struck poorly, dulled faster, or simply missed. Modern scholars argue this likely reflects stress-induced performance failure, fear making warriors clumsy. But to the men experiencing it, the cause didn't matter. The effect felt supernatural, and fear loves patterns. One failed hunt becomes a bad day. 2 becomes suspicion. 3 becomes a rule. Soon, a mental shortcut forms. Things go wrong around these people. You start noticing how often Vikings describe Sami encounters without clear endings. No decisive victory, no clear defeat, just unease, trade exchanges that felt heavy, conversations that went quiet too quickly, departures that felt rushed for reasons no one could quite articulate. And Vikings hated unresolved stories. They believed life should follow arcs, challenge, struggle, outcome, glory or death, Valhalla or the grave. The Sami disrupted that narrative rhythm. Encounters simply drifted. Even bravery failed to function properly here. Charging forward felt wrong. Retreating felt embarrassing. Standing still felt dangerous. So Vikings did something rare. They adapted. They approached Sami lands carefully. They listened more than they spoke. They accepted trades without pushing for dominance. They refrained from insults, even accidental ones. In a culture built on testing strength, this restraint stands out sharply. It's worth noting, because scholars argue about this endlessly, that there is no record of large-scale Sami-Viking warfare. That absence itself is telling. Either conflict never happened, or it never escalated. And in a violent age, avoiding escalation was an achievement. Fear, in this case, worked like a boundary line, not drawn on maps, not guarded by soldiers, but held in collective imagination. You can feel how this kind of fear settles into bones rather than minds. It changes posture, it changes tone, it teaches caution without instruction. As the night deepens around you, notice how the Vikings' greatest strength, their certainty, began to soften here. Not break, just bend. And bending, for them, was far more uncomfortable than snapping. Because to accept that someone else understands the world in a way you don't is to accept that your gods might not be the only ones listening. The land itself changes how you think once you stay long enough. That's the thing Vikings slowly realized and didn't like admitting. This wasn't just unfamiliar territory. It was territory that refused to behave. Fields don't open here the way they do farther south. Forests don't politely step back to let you pass. Snow doesn't merely fall, it settles, rearranges, hides, erases. Paths vanish overnight. Lakes harden into mirrors that look solid until they suddenly aren't. To Vikings, land was something you tamed. You cleared it, named it, marked it with fences, graves, stories of conquest. Land submitted, eventually, if you were stubborn enough. But this land didn't submit, and the people who lived here didn't try to make it. The Sami moved with the terrain rather than against it. Their routes curved instead of cutting straight. Their timing followed animals, light, wind, not calendars. To Viking eyes, this looked like avoidance, like weakness, until they tried following. There's a recurring saga detail easy to miss, that Vikings traveling north often complained of exhaustion far beyond what distance alone should cause. Modern historians chalk it up to terrain and weather, but in the moment, men experience something different. Frustration without a clear enemy. You can't swing at deep snow. You can't threaten a frozen river. You can't intimidate darkness. And yet the Sami navigated all of this calmly, predictably, without drama. That calm is important. Fear feeds on imbalance. When one side struggles and the other doesn't, explanations rush in to fill the gap. Vikings began describing the land as favoring the Sami, forests opening for them, storms waiting until strangers arrived, animals behaving strangely skittish for Norse hunters, cooperative for locals. Now, here's where a scholarly debate sneaks in softly. Some historians argue that Sami environmental knowledge created a perception gap so wide it felt supernatural. Others argue Viking accounts exaggerate failures to protect pride. Both sides agree on one thing: perception mattered more than truth. If you believe the land chooses sides, you stop pushing your luck. And Vikings were pragmatic enough to listen when luck turned sour. Imagine trying to march a group of armored men through waist-deep snow while locals glide effortlessly on skis. Yes, skis. Centuries before Vikings adopted them seriously. That's not magic. That's technology and tradition. But to a watching warrior, it feels humiliating in a way that cuts deeper than defeat. There's a fringe tidbit that often surprises people. Early skis appear in Sami culture long before widespread Norse use, and Vikings encountering this would have seen movement that looked almost unreal, people sliding across snow silently, faster than walking men could chase. No wonder stories drifted towards spirits and ghosts. The land amplified this effect. Sound behaves differently in cold air. Distance lies. You hear footsteps that aren't there. You don't hear ones that are. Wind moves oddly through trees, creating patterns that feel deliberate. So when Vikings said forests watch them, they weren't being poetic. They were describing a nervous system overloaded by unfamiliar signals. Meanwhile, the Sami left almost nothing behind. No plowed fields, no permanent roads, no obvious signs of wealth to steal. Vikings preferred enemies who displayed success visibly. Gold gleamed, farms spread, cities rose. All of it justified violence. Here, there was nothing to justify anything. You can feel how frustration replaces aggression. Why raid people who don't stockpile? Why burn what can't be found again tomorrow? Why fight those who don't stand still long enough to be threatened? The land makes violence inefficient. That's a concept Vikings understood well. They weren't suicidal. Raids worked because they were efficient, quick reward, minimal loss. Northern land offered the opposite bargain: effort with no guarantee, risk without glory, cold without feast. And slowly, quietly, land became part of Sami defense without ever being weaponized deliberately. It's not that Sami controlled the environment. They cooperated with it. And cooperation looks like control to outsiders who only understand dominance. Think about that comparison for a moment. Vikings tried to dominate waves with ships. Sami moved around snow with grace. One feels heroic, the other feels unsettling. Because if survival doesn't require struggle, what does that say about struggle itself? By now, your breathing is slower, the story isn't rushing, neither does the land. That's the rhythm you're settling into, the one Vikings never quite managed to adopt here. This place doesn't reward force, it rewards listening, and those who don't listen don't get dramatic endings. They get lost, tired, confused, and eventually gone from the story altogether. By the time drums enter the story, the fear already has roots. That matters, because drums don't scare people on their own, meaning does. You're sitting near a fire now, not too close, because sparks behave strangely in cold air. Someone mentions hearing something earlier. Not words, not footsteps, a rhythm, low, slow, not meant for dancing or marching, just steady, the kind of sound that doesn't hurry. To Vikings, sound was a signal. Horns meant battle, shouts meant challenge, songs meant memory. Drums, especially slow ones, meant something else entirely: ritual. And ritual, in their worldview, was where the normal rules loosened. The Sami used drums differently than the Norse expected. These weren't instruments for entertainment. They were tools, maps in a way, painted with symbols, animals, paths, suns, shapes that didn't translate cleanly into words. Each mark carried layers of meaning that only made sense when combined with rhythm, intention, and context. From the outside, it looked like someone beating a story into the air. Vikings watching this didn't know what they were seeing, but they knew what it felt like. The sense that something was being accessed, not summoned loudly, just opened quietly, like a door you didn't realize was there until it moved. There's a scholarly argument here that never quite resolves. Some historians frame these rituals as psychological grounding, ways to focus, remember routes, predict weather, prepare for hunts. Others argue that the spiritual framework mattered just as much as the practical outcome. The truth probably lives somewhere uncomfortably in between. What matters for this story is how it was perceived. Vikings believed the Sami could reach places the living weren't supposed to go while still breathing. That their drums didn't just make sound, but made passage between states, between moments, between now and later. That belief didn't come from nowhere. Men reported seeing Sami shamans fall into stillness, breathing shallow, eyes unfocused while the drumbeat continued. Minutes passed, sometimes longer. When they returned, they spoke with certainty about weather, about animals, about who would arrive and when. Was it trance? Was it practiced observation sharpened to an art? Was it storytelling designed to maintain authority? The Viking mind didn't care which explanation was correct, because certainty itself was frightening. Here's a quirky detail that shows up in fragments. Vikings believed that if you interrupted a Sami drum ritual, something terrible would follow, not immediately, but eventually. A bad voyage, a broken weapon, a sickness with no clear cause. That delayed consequence is important. Immediate punishment can be tested. Delayed punishment can't. Fear thrives on delays. So Vikings learned not to interfere, not to mock, not to ask too many questions. Respect wasn't admiration, it was self-preservation. Notice how this changes power dynamics. The Sami didn't threaten, they didn't warn, they didn't announce rules. The rules existed anyway, carried through rumor and repetition. You can feel how this shifts the room. Conversation lowers. Jokes stop halfway through. Someone glances toward the forest edge, then pretends they didn't. Because what if the drums aren't for you? What if they're about you? Vikings believed words spoken during ritual carried weight long after the sound faded. That intention mattered. That focusing on someone even silently could tilt events. It's the kind of belief that makes people behave carefully without being told to. And again, no battles followed, no dramatic clashes, just avoidance, deference, space given. There's a fringe tidbit scholars sometimes smile at. Some accounts claim Vikings thought the drums could trap a man's luck, hold it in place so nothing went right until released. Modern psychology would call that a self-fulfilling prophecy. But prophecy or not, results were results. Luck dried up, confidence cracked, men wanted to leave. As you settle deeper into this rhythm, notice how fear here doesn't spike. It spreads evenly, calmly, like cold seeping through layers until you stop trying to fight it and simply adjust. The drums don't chase. They don't shout. They don't need to. They mark time differently. And anyone who hears that difference and understands it just enough to be unsettled knows this isn't a place where rushing makes sense. So the Vikings didn't rush. They waited. They listened. And very often they chose to go elsewhere. By now, the word starts circling in the Viking mind, even if no one says it out loud. Seidr. Magic, but not the loud kind. Not fireballs or curses shouted into the wind. Seidr was quieter, heavier. It dealt with influence rather than force, with nudges instead of commands, and that made it far more uncomfortable. Among Vikings, Seidr existed, but it sat at the edges of respectability, practiced cautiously, whispered about, often associated with shame. A man who leaned too deeply into it risked being seen as crossing a line, softening himself, surrendering control, stepping away from the clear, hard certainty of weapons and honor. That's important, because the Sami didn't seem ashamed at all. They practiced spiritual work openly, calmly, without apology, and that contrast alone felt threatening. If Vikings flirted with magic like a dangerous secret, the Sami lived with it like a tool they understood completely. You can feel how that difference unsettles people who define themselves by dominance. Viking magic, when it appeared, was usually framed as desperate or extreme, used when strength failed. Sami ritual, from the outside, looked routine, integrated, balanced, and that suggested something Vikings didn't want to consider, that power didn't always need violence to function. There's a scholarly debate that fits neatly here. Some historians argue that Norse descriptions of Sami magic reflect cultural anxiety about masculinity. Others say it's less about gender and more about control. Vikings feared anything that worked without confrontation. Both arguments circle the same discomfort from different angles. The Sami didn't meet you head on. They didn't escalate. They didn't respond predictably. And unpredictability is terrifying to people trained for combat. Vikings believed Seidr could bend outcomes, cloud judgment, stir confusion, tilt probability. They told stories of warriors suddenly doubting themselves, forgetting simple things, losing confidence for no obvious reason after offending Sami practitioners. Here's a quirky tidbit that appears in later retellings. Some Vikings believed Sami magic worked better on those who mocked it. Skepticism itself was seen as vulnerability. Whether that belief came first or formed later doesn't really matter. Once it existed, skepticism disappeared quickly. Notice how fear here becomes self-regulating. No one enforces silence. No one issues threats. The culture does the work. Vikings approaching Sami communities became unusually polite, careful with words, careful with gestures. They offered gifts without bargaining too hard. They accepted outcomes without pushing. That behavior stands out sharply against typical Viking interactions elsewhere. Respect was usually earned through strength. Here, it was preemptive. And that's where fear truly settles in, not as panic, but as etiquette. There's a comparison worth lingering on. Vikings trusted steel because steel was visible. You could see it, touch it, count it, see they're operated invisibly. You only noticed it after something went wrong, and by then it was too late to respond directly. Delayed consequences again, untraceable causes, no clear enemy. Those are nightmare conditions for a warrior culture. The Sami didn't need to demonstrate power dramatically. The idea of their influence traveled far enough on its own. Stories stacked, caution compounded. Over time, even Vikings who had never met a Sami person behaved as if they had, and that's how fear scales without effort. You can imagine a Viking father warning his son not with anger, but seriousness. Don't insult them. Don't linger. Don't interfere with their rituals. Not because they'll attack you, but because things might quietly stop going your way. That's not a threat you can challenge. As the night deepens, notice how this kind of power doesn't demand belief. It only requires uncertainty, and uncertainty, when mixed with pride, produces caution faster than force ever could. The Sami didn't need Vikings to fear them consciously. They just needed Vikings to hesitate. And hesitation, in a world built on decisive action, was enough to redraw boundaries without a single drop of blood. By the time the stories reach the sea, they've already grown teeth. Sailors are the best carriers of fear, not because they exaggerate more than others, but because they depend on forces they cannot control. Wind, current, visibility, timing. A farmer can fight bad soil. A sailor negotiates with the invisible every day. So when sailors began linking storms to certain encounters, people listened. You're on a long ship now. The wood creaks in a way you know well. The men around you are experienced. Not boys, not fools. They've crossed open water before, faced fog and waves and nights where the stars disappeared. This isn't their first uncertainty, and yet something feels off. The wind shifts without warning, not violently at first, just enough to unsettle the sail. Someone adjusts the rigging. Someone else glances back toward the shoreline. There was a trade there earlier. Quiet, polite, short. Nothing went wrong, and that's exactly what's wrong. The clouds thicken, not dramatically, but decisively. The sea darkens. Waves don't grow huge, but they become awkward, misaligned. The ship pitches just enough to exhaust the crew faster than expected. Progress slows. Morale thins. This is where pattern recognition kicks in. Vikings didn't need storms to be unnatural to fear them. They just needed them to feel timed. And in sailor stories, timing is everything. Storms that arrive after disrespect. Winds that rise after certain names are spoken. Weather that clears only once land is far behind. The conclusion forms quietly. Someone did something wrong. Here's the scholarly debate tucked gently into the dark. Historians argue whether Norse sailors attributed storms to Sami influence because of actual encounters, or whether the Sami became convenient explanations for unpredictable northern weather. The answer, frustratingly, is probably both. Humans look for meaning when survival is on the line, and sailors survived by believing the world was responsive. That belief hardened into legend. The storms weren't always catastrophic. In fact, that made them worse. Ships weren't always destroyed. Crews weren't always lost. Instead, voyages were delayed. Cargo spoiled. Men returned tired, shaken, embarrassed without knowing why. Failure without explanation erodes confidence. And confidence was everything to Vikings. One quirky tidbit shows up repeatedly. Some sailors claimed that storms linked to Sami encounters felt different, less violent, more persistent. Not roaring destruction, but grinding resistance. Like being gently but firmly told to go somewhere else. Psychologists would later call that selective memory. Sailors remembered storms that fit the narrative and forgot ones that didn't. But memory shapes culture, not statistics, and culture decides behavior. So, captains adjusted routes, they sailed wider arcs, they avoided certain shores, they took longer paths if it meant fewer uneasy encounters. These weren't cowards. These were men responsible for ships, cargo, crews, reputations. Fear didn't need to shout. It only needed to whisper consistently. Soon, younger sailors learned these habits without knowing why. They copied what experienced men did. They absorbed the caution without hearing the original stories. That's how fear becomes tradition. By the time someone finally asks, "Why do we sail this way?" the answer is vague. Bad luck up there. Strange winds. Better not to test it. Notice how the Sami still haven't acted. No curse pronounced, no demand made, no confrontation staged. The fear exists independently now, self-sustaining, carried by waves and voices. This is how reputations outlive reality. The sea, like the forest, becomes another quiet collaborator. It doesn't need instructions. It simply behaves as it always has. But belief reshapes interpretation. A headwind becomes a warning. A delay becomes a lesson. A near miss becomes proof. And so, slowly, the map redraws itself, not with ink, but with avoidance. Certain places gain a weight that discourages curiosity. Not forbidden, just inconvenient. As your breathing slows further, notice how this fear isn't dramatic. It doesn't spike your heart. It settles into decision-making, into habits, into routes chosen and routes forgotten. The Vikings didn't stop sailing north because they were afraid. They stopped because the cost felt unnecessary. And nothing terrifies a culture built on expansion more than realizing some directions simply aren't worth pushing into. By the time the knots appear, the story has fully crossed into legend. But legends don't grow unless something keeps feeding them. You hear about it the way most dangerous ideas spread. Casually. A sailor mentions it while fixing rope. Someone laughs too quickly. Another man doesn't laugh at all. The idea hangs there, swaying gently, like a loose line on deck. The Sami can sell wind, not command it, not create it, just sell it. As if wind were something you could fold, measure, and hand over. The story goes like this. A Sami trader offers a rope with knots tied into it. One knot promises a gentle breeze. 2 knots bring strong wind. 3 knots, well, 3 knots are not recommended unless you're desperate or foolish. What matters isn't whether this actually happened. What matters is that Vikings behaved as if it had. Think about what wind means to a sailor. It's movement, timing, survival, profit. Without it, you're stranded. With too much of it, you're dead. Wind already feels alive, moody, responsive to invisible moods. Attaching intention to it doesn't feel like a leap. It feels like naming something you already suspect. So, when sailors claimed that a breeze arrived exactly when a knot was loosened, no one demanded proof. The sea had trained them not to. Here's the scholarly argument that hums quietly underneath. Some historians believe the wind knot story reflects early trade in meteorological knowledge. Locals knew when seasonal winds would shift. Outsiders mistook prediction for control. Others argue the story is pure symbolism, a way of explaining why certain sailors succeeded while others didn't. Either way, the effect was the same. Vikings began treating Sami traders with a strange mix of respect and caution. They didn't haggle too aggressively, they didn't insult, They didn't test claims, because what if it worked? And worse, what if mocking it made things fail later? This is where fear becomes transactional. You don't need to believe completely, you just need to believe enough not to interfere. There's a quirky detail tucked into later retellings. Some sailors claimed they bought the rope, but never dared untie more than one knot. The idea of holding potential disaster in your hands was more frightening than calm seas were comforting. Control without certainty is terrifying. And notice how the Sami, again, don't advertise. They don't chase sailors down the dock shouting offers. The story travels on its own. That restraint adds credibility. Real con artists push. Real power waits. Vikings told these stories in winter halls. Voices low, fires crackling. Young men listened carefully. Older men nodded without smiling. No one suggested testing it deliberately, because even if the wind didn't obey knots, belief did. A sailor who expects trouble sails differently. He hesitates, he delays, he tightens ropes too much or too little. He reads every gust as confirmation. That's how a legend becomes reality without changing the weather at all. By now, you can feel the pattern repeating. The Sami never need to threaten. They never need to demonstrate power loudly. Their influence operates in the space between cause and effect, where human minds rush to fill gaps. Wind arrives, timing aligns, stories lock in place, and slowly a conclusion settles into Viking culture. Don't provoke them, don't mock them, don't assume you understand what's being offered, because the cost of being wrong feels higher than the cost of believing. As the ship glides onward in your imagination, notice how the sea doesn't roar, it sighs. The sail tightens, the rope hums softly. Somewhere behind you, land fades into fog, and whether the wind was sold, predicted, or purely imagined no longer matters. What matters is this: the Vikings stopped believing they were alone in controlling their fate, and that realization, quiet, unsettling, irreversible, changed how far they were willing to go. By the time you notice what's missing, it's already become normal. There are no great battles in these stories, no shields splintering, no heroic last stands, no skells composing verses about blood-soaked snow. Instead, there's something far stranger absence. Raids that never happen, routes that quietly change, expeditions planned, discussed, equipped, and then gently forgotten. It's as if the story itself refuses to move forward when it points north. For a culture that measured success through action, this was deeply unsettling. Vikings didn't usually decide not to fight. They fought and lost, or fought and won. Either way, something happened. Here, nothing happened, and that nothing left a heavier mark than defeat ever could. You hear about ships turning back before land is even sighted, about leaders waking from uneasy dreams and calling off plans without explanation, about men who simply say, "Not today," and no one argues. There's a scholarly phrase that fits perfectly here: preemptive avoidance. It means choosing not to engage based on anticipated cost rather than actual threat. Historians debate whether this avoidance was conscious strategy or accumulated superstition, but in lived experience, the distinction disappears, because fear doesn't need logic once it feels justified. Imagine a group of warriors preparing for a raid. They sharpen blades, check armor, joke loudly, because that's what men do before danger. Then someone mentions the land ahead, casually, like it's nothing. The jokes thin out. Someone recalls a cousin who went that way and came back quieter. Someone else remembers a trader who lost cargo without ever seeing an enemy. No one can point to a clear incident. That's the problem. You can't plan around vagueness. Viking warfare thrived on predictability. Even enemies had patterns. Even danger followed rules. But this felt like stepping into a place where rules dissolved quietly. Here's a quirky tidbit buried in saga structure itself. Many Norse stories introduce northern journeys only to cut away abruptly, shifting focus elsewhere. Some scholars argue this reflects lost material. Others suggest storytellers intentionally avoided elaborating on places associated with unease. Silence, again, doing narrative work, and silence spreads faster than warning. Soon, younger men learn limits without being taught. They notice where elders hesitate, which stories trail off, which directions inspire fewer boasts. Fear becomes inherited, not taught explicitly, but absorbed. That's how boundaries form without fences. The Sami didn't need to repel invaders physically. Reputation did it for them. Every aborted raid reinforced the next. Every story that ended early taught the same lesson. This place doesn't reward curiosity. And think about how rare that is in history. Most uninvaded lands relied on distance, difficulty, or overwhelming force. Here, it was perception, an invisible wall built from hesitation and respect tangled together. The Vikings were practical enough to accept it. Why waste men on land that offers no glory? Why chase wealth that won't stay put? Why fight people who don't seem interested in winning? This wasn't cowardice, it was efficiency. Vikings prided themselves on knowing when to press and when to pull back. The fact that they consistently pulled back here says everything. As you settle deeper into the rhythm of the story, notice how this fear doesn't escalate, it stabilizes. It becomes background knowledge, the kind that shapes maps, songs, and decisions without ever being questioned directly. You don't talk about it much. You don't challenge it loudly. You just adjust. And so the most effective defense the Sami ever had wasn't weapons or walls, but something far quieter. They made invasion feel unnecessary. And in a world built on taking, that may have been the most terrifying thing of all. By now, you've learned to pay attention to what isn't there. No footprints, no camps left behind long enough to study, no clear sign that anyone is watching, yet the feeling never quite goes away. That feeling followed Vikings inland more than anything else. They were hunters themselves, after all. They knew what it meant to track something without being seen. They understood patience. But this was different. This wasn't a chase. It was the sense of being measured. The Sami hunted in ways that made Vikings uneasy because the hunt didn't announce itself. Animals weren't driven loudly toward traps. There was no dramatic struggle. Reindeer moved as if guided rather than forced. Game appeared where it was expected, not where it was chased. To a Viking, used to asserting dominance over prey, this looked backwards, almost disrespectful, as if the animal had agreed. There's an old observation tucked into later accounts. Norse hunters complained that animals behaved incorrectly in Sami territory. They bolted too early, changed directions suddenly, refused to follow familiar patterns. Modern scholars would explain this as deep ecological knowledge, migration timing, wind reading, scent control. But in the moment, it felt like sabotage. And sabotage implies intention. The Sami didn't hunt in groups large enough to notice easily. One person could disappear into snow and forest without leaving signs others could read. Clothing blended into landscape. Movement followed terrain. rather than cutting across it. Fires were controlled carefully, smoke minimized, heat concealed. Vikings noticed all of this, but only after failing to notice the Sami themselves. That's the unsettling part. You don't see someone watching you. You realize they must have already been watching. There's a fringe tidbit that often gets overlooked. Some Vikings believed Sami hunters could follow tracks backward, reading where someone would go, rather than where they had been. That sounds absurd until you remember how human movement becomes predictable under stress. Fear narrows choices, paths repeat. Prediction starts to look like foresight, and foresight, again, edges toward magic. Imagine a Viking scouting party moving cautiously through unfamiliar forest. Every snapped twig feels loud. Every shadow feels deliberate. No ambush comes, no arrows fly, no threat presents itself. And that's worse, because it suggests restraint, control, awareness without reaction. Warriors are trained to respond to danger. They are not trained to sit inside uncertainty for long periods. It eats at confidence. It turns imagination inward. You start questioning your own noise, your own scent, your own intentions. The Sami never needed to confront intruders directly. Their invisibility did the work for them. Vikings left those forests telling stories that never sounded quite right. Stories where nothing happened, but everything felt wrong. There's a scholarly phrase that fits neatly here: psychological dominance through environmental mastery. It sounds heavy, but the idea is simple. If one group moves comfortably through a space and the other doesn't, power shifts without confrontation. That shift terrifies warriors more than resistance ever could. Vikings expected opposition. They expected arrows, spears, shields. They didn't expect absence. They didn't expect to feel clumsy and exposed while no one else seemed to struggle. And remember, these were men who believed the world was alive, that land, animals, and fate could respond to behavior. Feeling watched by the forest wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. So stories changed tone. Instead of boasting, men spoke cautiously. Instead of describing victories, they described sensations, pressure, unease, wrongness. They began warning others not about danger, but about discomfort. Don't stay too long. Don't wander alone. Don't assume you're unseen. Those warnings spread faster than tales of battle ever could. And notice the brilliance of it. Even if it was never intentional, reindeer moved through the land with a confidence Vikings couldn't imitate. They didn't scatter wildly at every unfamiliar scent. They flowed, adjusted, changed direction without panic. And the Sami moved with them, not ahead, not behind, but alongside. To a Viking hunter, animals were resources. You tracked them, cornered them, forced an outcome. Success was measured in dominance. The Sami approach felt softer, almost conversational, and that softness made Vikings deeply suspicious, because softness isn't supposed to work. There's a moment described in several scattered accounts where Norse observers note that Sami hunters spoke to animals, not theatrically, not loudly, but in low, steady tones. No one claimed the animals understood language. What frightened people was the timing. Movement followed speech, decisions aligned. Coincidence, of course, but coincidence that repeats becomes pattern. Here's a scholarly phrase that hums gently beneath this: animistic relational systems. It means viewing animals not as objects, but as participants in a shared environment. Vikings had traces of this belief too, but they buried it beneath conquest. Seeing it practiced openly, effectively, without apology, it stirred something uncomfortable. And discomfort breeds stories, Wolves didn't attack Sami camps the way they attacked others. Birds circled differently. Fish appeared when needed. None of this was miraculous. All of it was explainable through long observation and restraint. But Vikings didn't see the years behind that knowledge. They saw results. And results without visible effort look like favors. The Sami didn't hunt everything. They didn't take more than necessary. They didn't chase until exhaustion. That restraint shaped animal behavior over generations. Animals learned what to fear and what not to. Patterns formed quietly. Vikings, arriving briefly and violently, disrupted those patterns. Animals fled. Routes broke. Success vanished. It felt personal. There's a fringe tidbit that still makes historians pause. Some Norse sources imply that animals warned the Sami of approaching strangers. Modern explanations point to sound, vibration, scent carried long distances. But again, the explanation doesn't undo the feeling. If animals know before you do, what else might? That idea lodges deep in the mind. You imagine a Viking camp preparing to hunt at dawn, spears ready, dogs restless. The forest feels tense, not hostile, just alert. The hunt fails. Again and again. No clear reason, no clear mistake. Confidence drains. The Sami, meanwhile, continue calmly. Meat appears. Fires burn briefly. Nothing feels rushed. This contrast eats at warrior pride, because Vikings believed mastery should look aggressive, loud, decisive. Sami mastery looked patient, observant, almost kind. Kindness shouldn't dominate warriors. Yet here, it did. The realization creeps in slowly. Fighting people like this wouldn't feel like battle. It would feel like breaking something delicate that somehow survives anyway. And that's a terrible feeling for a culture built on honor. You notice how stories begin framing Sami animals as extensions of their will, not controlled but cooperative, as if the land itself leans slightly in their favor, as if choosing not to exploit too hard earned you quiet allies. Night is where fear finishes its work. Daytime discomfort can be explained away. Weather, hunger, bad luck. Night removes those excuses. Darkness stretches time. Silence amplifies thought. And when you believe the world is layered, night feels like the hour when layers slide out of alignment. This is when the stories sharpen. Vikings believed souls could travel while bodies slept. Dreams weren't random, they were messages, warnings, sometimes rehearsals for what was coming. To sleep badly before a journey was a sign. To dream strangely after meeting certain people was a verdict. And around Sami lands, dreams changed. Men reported the same patterns again and again. Dreams where they stood still while others moved around them. Dreams where voices spoke without mouths. Dreams where paths twisted back on themselves, leading nowhere familiar. The unsettling part wasn't fear inside the dream. It was clarity. You wake knowing something has shifted, even if you can't explain how. Here's where belief crosses into paranoia, but gently, not explosively. Vikings began to suspect that Sami practitioners could travel without bodies, that while camps slept, something moved, watched, measured intention rather than action. Astral travel is the phrase modern people use, but Vikings didn't frame it that way. To them, it was sending awareness, sending influence, sending attention, and attention, once directed, mattered. There's a scholarly debate that fits neatly into this quiet hour. Some historians argue that shared dream motifs indicate cultural transmission stories influencing subconscious imagery. Others suggest stress in unfamiliar environments trigger similar dreams across groups. Both explanations can be true at once, because fear doesn't need to be invented. It only needs to be suggested. Imagine waking before dawn, heart steady but mind unsettled. No nightmare, no panic, just a lingering sense of being known, not hunted, not threatened, known. That's far worse. Because how do you fight someone who already understands you? Vikings began attributing misfortune to these unseen movements. A weapon breaks unexpectedly. A man falls ill without injury. Navigation feels wrong even under clear stars. None of it dramatic enough to demand action. All of it cumulative enough to demand explanation. The explanation settled naturally. They reached us while we slept. Once that idea exists, it changes behavior immediately. Camps are arranged differently. Sleep becomes lighter. Men take turns waking unnecessarily. Everyone is more irritable, less confident. And exhaustion is a silent killer of courage. Here's a fringe tidbit worth lingering on. Some accounts suggest Vikings believed Sami dreamwalkers could borrow luck, take it temporarily, return it altered. Modern thinkers might call that projection, but projection still affects decisions. You don't raid well when you feel unlucky. You don't push forward when sleep offers no rest. And again, no confrontation follows. No dramatic proof. Just behavior shifting quietly around an invisible pressure. Notice how power works here. No command is issued. No rule enforced. People choose caution because the alternative feels irresponsible. Fear matures into strategy. By morning, the forest looks normal again. Snow glitters. Wind rests. Nothing visibly wrong. And yet decisions have already changed. Routes reconsidered. Plans shortened. Curiosity dampened. That's the brilliance of night fear. It doesn't leave marks. It leaves preferences. As your breathing slows, let the darkness feel less threatening now. You're not inside it. You're observing it from safety. But for Vikings, that line felt thinner here. They didn't fear being attacked in their sleep. They feared being understood. And that fear, quiet, intimate, impossible to challenge, followed them long after they left these lands. Trade should have made things easier. It usually did. Trade meant rules, weights, expectations. It meant both sides wanted something tangible. Vikings were comfortable with trade because it turned strangers into participants. Once goods changed hands, uncertainty softened. But trade with the Sami never fully relaxed anyone. You imagine the meeting, brief, polite, efficient, goods laid out carefully, no raised voices, no crowd gathering, just a few people standing in cold air, exchanging things that mattered: fur, metal, tools, food. Nothing goes wrong. And somehow, that's the problem. Vikings were used to trade involving tension, haggling, posturing, subtle threats. Here, there was very little of that. The Sami didn't push for advantage. They didn't test boundaries. They didn't try to impress. They acted as if time itself wasn't pressing. That unnerved people, because urgency is a form of weakness Vikings understood. Calm suggested surplus, not of goods, but of confidence. If someone isn't in a hurry to extract value from you, they might already have enough of something you don't. There's a scholarly argument that fits neatly here. Some historians suggest Sami trade behavior reflected risk minimization rather than indifference. Others argue it was cultural preference. Either way, Norse observers interpreted it as detachment, and detachment from profit felt dangerous. Vikings left these encounters feeling oddly unbalanced. They got what they came for. No one cheated them. No conflict arose. And yet they didn't linger. Camps weren't set nearby. Fires weren't shared. Trade ended, and everyone stepped back. Here's a quirky detail buried in trading tales. Vikings reported feeling watched after trade concluded, not during, as if attention sharpened only once business was done. That inversion, calm during exchange, unease afterward, made no sense in a world where danger usually preceded negotiation. So Vikings shortened visits, they avoided overnight stays, they finished business quickly and moved on. Trade, instead of building familiarity, reinforced distance, and distance breeds mythology. Stories spread about Sami traders, knowing exactly what to offer, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Modern explanations point to experience, pattern recognition, repetition. But anticipation feels like insight when you don't understand the system behind it. That's how fear creeps back in through convenience. You didn't need to explain yourself. They already knew what you wanted. Why? Once again, Vikings chose caution over curiosity. They didn't press for explanations. They didn't try to integrate. They didn't attempt control, because trade didn't domesticate the unknown here. It highlighted it. As your breathing remains slow and even, notice how this section of the story never spikes. It settles. It shows how fear doesn't always look like panic. It often looks like politeness. Shorter conversations, quicker departures, routes adjusted subtly afterward. The Sami didn't reject trade. They just never let it turn into access. And for Vikings, used to trade opening doors, that restraint felt like another quiet boundary, one they learned not to cross. By the time kings enter the story, the fear has already done most of its work. Kings don't move quickly. They wait for patterns, they listen to reports, they notice which borders grow wealth and which simply resist. And when a direction produces more hesitation than profit, wise rulers don't need dramatic explanations. They just stop looking that way. Northern boundaries in the Viking world were strange, not sharply defended, not marked by walls or garrisons. They were defined by absence, by the lack of ambition to push further. That should stand out to you, because Vikings were not known for leaving opportunity untouched. Yet here, opportunity never quite announced itself. Kings heard the same things their sailors and traders did. Storms that arrived without warning, routes that drained morale, expeditions that returned quiet, thoughtful, diminished in ways that weren't measurable in losses. No king likes reports that can't be summarized cleanly. There's a scholarly phrase that fits gently here: strategic ambiguity. It means choosing not to clarify a situation, because clarity might demand action, and action, in this case, didn't promise reward. Some sagas hint that kings actively discouraged northern ventures, not through decrees but through indifference. Ships were funded elsewhere, raids planned southward, glory pointed in safer directions. That's an important detail, because it suggests fear wasn't just superstition among common men. It was acknowledged silently at the highest levels of power. Here's a fringe tidbit that historians still debate. A few Norse sources imply that royal advisors with reputations for foresight quietly warned against northern expansion. Whether these were seers, pragmatists, or simply cautious strategists doesn't really matter. What matters is that kings listened, and when kings listen without making speeches, borders harden invisibly. Notice how this fear doesn't inspire crusades or purges. There's no attempt to cleanse or conquer. Instead, there's a subtle acceptance that some lands are expensive in ways gold can't offset. Viking kings measured cost carefully. Ships, men, reputation, all finite. Losing any of those for unclear gain was bad governance. And so the North became optional. Maps stayed vague. Stories stayed incomplete. Ambition turned elsewhere. This is how fear matures into policy. No banners, no announcements, just a collective decision not to test something that didn't need testing. As your breathing stays slow and even, feel how calm this decision-making is. There's no panic here, just restraint and restraint. In a culture built on expansion, signals respect far louder than fear ever could. The Sami never negotiated with kings. They never threatened borders. They never demanded recognition. And yet they shaped royal behavior anyway. That's power most empires never achieve. When Christianity arrives, fear doesn't disappear. It changes costumes. The old gods retreat quietly, no dramatic exits, no final speeches. They fade the way old habits do, lingering in gestures, sayings, instincts people pretend they've abandoned. New prayers rise. New symbols hang in halls. New explanations are offered for the same uneasy feelings. And suddenly, what was once called mysterious becomes dangerous. The Sami don't change much at first. Their lives still follow seasons. Their movements still refuse to settle. Their rituals still exist, though now watched through a different lens. What once unsettled Viking warriors now unsettles Christian missionaries in a sharper, more absolute way. Because Christianity doesn't tolerate ambiguity well. Pagan magic could be admired, feared, bargained with. Christian doctrine demanded classification. Something was either holy or it was not, and whatever didn't fit cleanly into the new order became suspect. You can feel the shift in tone immediately. Where Vikings whispered about power, missionaries spoke of corruption. Where warriors avoided interference, priests demanded correction. Where fear once led to distance, it now demanded explanation. This matters because fear with a moral framework becomes aggressive. There's a scholarly debate that fits here like a slow drumbeat. Some historians argue Christianization intensified hostility towards Sami practices by reframing difference as sin. Others say the tension existed already and simply found new language. Both agree on the outcome. Curiosity hardened into judgment, and judgment is far less patient than fear. Missionaries traveling north wrote of drums as instruments of deception. Trance became possession. Alignment with animals became idolatry. Everything that once felt quietly powerful now felt threatening in a way that demanded response. But here's the interesting part. Even as the language sharpened, behavior didn't change much. People still hesitated. Kings still redirected ambition. Sailors still avoided certain routes. Fear remained. It was just justified differently. That contradiction confused missionaries deeply. If these practices were wrong, why weren't they confronted directly? Why wasn't there a campaign? Why wasn't the North flooded with correction the way other regions were? The answer sits in the same place it always has. The land still didn't reward intrusion. The people still didn't escalate. The costs still felt unclear. So fear adapted again. Instead of open confrontation, there was labeling. Instead of invasion, there was condemnation from a distance. Stories darkened, myths sharpened. What was once unknown became evil not because anything had changed, but because a new worldview needed certainty. Here's a quirky tidbit buried in church records. Some missionaries complain that Sami converts practiced Christianity incorrectly, mixing old rituals with new prayers, refusing to abandon seasonal movement, continuing traditions that didn't fit church calendars. To authorities, this wasn't resistance, it was confusion. But to the Sami, it was continuity, and continuity itself felt threatening. As your breathing stays slow and calm, notice how this section carries a quieter sadness. Fear has shifted from mutual caution to imbalance. One side now claims moral authority. The other becomes defined by accusation rather than reputation. Yet even now, there's restraint. No grand crusade north. No decisive conquest. No clean ending. Just pressure. Gradual. Uneven. Never quite complete. The terror that once stopped Vikings from advancing doesn't vanish. It gets absorbed into doctrine, into sermons, into warnings, spoken more loudly, but acted upon less directly. And through it all, the Sami remain, still moving, still adapting, still refusing to be easily categorized. And that refusal, soft, persistent, exhausting to challenge, continues to do what it always did. It slows people down. Fear hardens when patience runs out. That's what happens next, not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but in pockets. In moments where authority feels embarrassed by its own hesitation, in places where explanation has failed long enough, that force begins to feel simpler. This is where the trials begin. Not dramatic at first, not bonfires lighting up the night, just questions, accusations framed as concern, requests to explain practices that never needed explaining before. Drums are confiscated, ritual objects are labeled suspicious, silence is interpreted as guilt, and something important breaks here. Because earlier fear was mutual, Vikings were uneasy, but they also felt watched in return. Now fear becomes one-directional. It flows downward, backed by institutions, laws, sermons, delivered with confidence rather than doubt. The Sami haven't changed, but the rules have. Christian authorities, increasingly frustrated by ambiguity, begin recording what they don't understand as evidence. Stories once whispered as caution are now written down as warning. Rituals become witchcraft. Trance becomes possession. Knowledge becomes deception. There's a scholarly debate that surfaces here, heavy but unavoidable. Some historians argue witch trials in the north were extensions of European trends. Others insist they were intensified by long-standing fear of Sami difference. The consensus, uneasy and incomplete, is that old terror finally found a language that justified action. That language had consequences. Trials weren't always public. Some were administrative, quiet removals, forced confessions shaped by interpreters who didn't share the same concepts of belief. Guilt defined before questions were even asked. What once inspired avoidance now inspired control. And yet notice what's missing again. There's no widespread rebellion, no uprising, no dramatic resistance, because the Sami had never relied on confrontation. They adapted the way they always had by narrowing what was visible. Rituals became quieter, knowledge passed more privately, practices folded inward rather than disappearing. Here's a fringe tidbit historians argue about endlessly. Some trial records describe confessions so inconsistent they suggest misunderstanding rather than admission. Were people admitting to magic, or simply agreeing with whatever description authorities provided to end the ordeal? The answer varies, and that uncertainty still haunts the documents. Fear, once protective, now wounds, but it doesn't erase. The irony is heavy here. Authorities believed they were rooting out dangerous power. In reality, they were chasing shadows left behind by centuries of misinterpretation. What they confronted wasn't threat, it was difference that had never asked permission to exist. And still, the land refused to cooperate. Northern territories remained difficult. Conversion remained partial. Control remained uneven. For all the language of dominance, reality stayed stubbornly complex. As your breathing remains slow, let this part of the story soften rather than sharpen. This isn't a climax, it's a thinning. Fear losing its mythic edge and becoming something colder, bureaucratic, procedural, tired. The terror that once stopped Vikings in their tracks didn't explode into violence. It eroded into paperwork, and somehow that feels more unsettling. By the time scholars enter the conversation, the danger has already passed, but the confusion hasn't. Centuries later, people sit in warm rooms, far from snow and silence, trying to decide what all of this meant. They read sagas, they examine trial records, they argue gently over footnotes and phrasing, and the same question keeps resurfacing in different disguises. Was any of this real? Not the people that's not in doubt, but the fear, the power, the hesitation, the storms that followed, the luck that thinned out, the sense of being watched. Some historians argue firmly that nothing supernatural was happening at all, that this was a collision of cultures, environments, and expectations. That Viking failure in the north stemmed from poor adaptation, not mystical resistance. That fear filled the gaps left by ignorance. Others push back, not claiming magic but pointing out that belief itself is a force. That when enough people behave as if something is dangerous, it becomes dangerous in practical ways. Decisions change, roots alter, confidence erodes, outcomes shift, and that debate never quite settles. Here's the phrase that gets tossed around most carefully: psychological amplification. It means fear feeding on itself, growing stronger through repetition rather than evidence. But that explanation doesn't fully satisfy anyone because it treats people like passive receivers rather than active interpreters. Vikings weren't gullible. They weren't naive. They were experienced, observant, pragmatic. So why did they hesitate? This is where the debate deepens. Some scholars suggest the fear wasn't about the Sami at all, but about limits, about Vikings encountering a space where their usual tools, violence, speed, intimidation, didn't work efficiently. Rather than admit that, they framed resistance as mystical. Others counter that this explanation underestimates the sophistication of indigenous knowledge systems, that calling everything misunderstanding repeats the same dismissal that fueled persecution later. And quietly, a third idea sits between those arguments. Maybe it wasn't magic, maybe it wasn't ignorance, maybe it was respect that didn't have language yet. The Sami didn't challenge Vikings directly. They didn't compete for the same resources in the same ways. They didn't escalate. They simply existed differently, and that difference disrupted assumptions so deeply it felt dangerous. Fear, in that sense, wasn't panic. It was recalibration. Vikings adjusted expectations. They learned where their models failed. They accepted that not all power announces itself loudly, that some strength is environmental, relational, slow. That realization doesn't make for heroic stories. It makes for footnotes. And yet, those footnotes changed history because the North remained less conquered than it could have been, because routes bent, instead of cutting straight. Because one of history's most aggressive cultures paused, not forever, not completely, but long enough to matter. As your breathing stays calm, notice how the debate itself mirrors the story. No clean answer, no final verdict, just overlapping explanations that refuse to collapse into certainty. And maybe that's fitting, because the thing that terrified Vikings wasn't a spell or a curse. It was the idea that the world didn't always respond to force. By now, enough distance exists to start pulling myths apart gently, the way you loosen a knot instead of yanking it free. Because when you strip away fear, story by story, what's left isn't sorcery, it's competence. The Vikings didn't misjudge the Sami because they were foolish. They misjudged them because they measured intelligence using the wrong tools. They looked for cities, armies, hoarded wealth, visible signs of power. When they didn't find those things, they assumed absence. What they failed to recognize was systems, knowledge that wasn't written down but practiced daily, navigation without maps, weather prediction without instruments, sustainability without slogans. Vikings were excellent at extracting value quickly. The Sami were excellent at making value last. Those two strengths don't clash loudly, they frustrate each other quietly. This is where modern understanding reframes old fear. Sami people didn't disappear into the land. They read it. They didn't control animals, they anticipated them. They didn't summon storms, they knew when not to travel. They didn't curse luck, they minimized risk. But to an outsider trained in dominance, risk avoidance looks like foresight. Foresight looks like prophecy, and prophecy feels like threat. There's a scholarly phrase that fits here perfectly: epistemic mismatch. It means two groups using different ways of knowing the world, each misunderstanding the other's intelligence because it doesn't look familiar. Vikings expected power to announce itself. The Sami expected power to stay quiet. That mismatch explains nearly every mystical detail once fear is removed. Silent movement, efficient clothing, terrain awareness, animals behaving differently, long-term coexistence, storms avoided, seasonal knowledge and patience, trance states, focus, memory, altered attention, not chaos. Even the famous drums, once stripped of myth, become cognitive tools, mnemonics, maps, calendars. Not magic, but meaning encoded rhythmically. Still powerful, just not supernatural. And here's the uncomfortable part. Once Vikings realized this once, the fear softened into understanding it was already too late to change the story. Reputation had hardened, boundaries had formed, kings had adjusted ambition. The myth had done its work. That's something historians emphasize carefully. Myths don't need to be accurate to be effective. They only need to be consistent. The Sami didn't set out to scare anyone. They didn't cultivate terror as strategy. But when terror appeared, they didn't rush to dismantle it either. Why would they? It kept strangers cautious. It reduced disruption. It preserved balance. That's not deception. That's adaptation. And adaptation, when misunderstood, often gets labeled as threat. As you sink deeper into the story's rhythm, notice how different this feels now. Less sharp, more grounded, fear dissolving into comprehension, not diminishing the Sami, but clarifying them. They weren't terrifying because they were mystical. They were terrifying because they proved something Vikings didn't want to learn yet: that survival doesn't require conquest. That power doesn't need spectacle. That mastery can look like restraint, Once you understand that, the fear feels almost respectful, because what frightened Vikings most wasn't being attacked. It was realizing they were not the only ones who knew how to live well in a harsh world. By the time you reach this point, the question has quietly flipped. It's no longer why the Vikings feared the Sami. It's why that fear worked so well. Because fear usually burns hot and fast. It provokes overreaction, violence, mistakes. Yet this fear did the opposite. It slowed people down. It discouraged testing. It preserved space without demanding it. That kind of fear is rare. Think about what usually protects a people. Walls, weapons, numbers, alliances. The Sami had none of these in a form Vikings recognized, and yet their lands remained comparatively untouched for generations. The shield wasn't physical, it was reputational. Once a place becomes known as expensive, not in gold, but in effort, morale, certainty, it stops attracting attention. Raiders look for efficiency. Kings look for returns. Traders look for predictability. This land offered none of those on outsider terms, so people chose easier directions. That choice repeated often enough to become habit. Here's where comparison helps. Vikings didn't hesitate around rich monasteries, even when protected. They didn't hesitate around rival kingdoms, even when dangerous. But they did hesitate here, where reward was unclear and discomfort was guaranteed. That tells you something important. Fear didn't protect the Sami by promising punishment. It protected them by promising inconvenience, cold nights, confusion, effort without glory. Those are deal breakers for expansion cultures. There's a scholarly phrase that captures this perfectly. Negative incentive landscapes. It means environments structured in ways that discourage intrusion without active resistance. The Sami didn't need to say, "Don't come." The land, the rhythm, the stories said it for them. And once that message settled, it didn't need reinforcement. Children grew up hearing it. Sailors inherited it. Kings governed around it. The fear became ambient part of the background noise of decision-making. No one questioned it directly because questioning it offered no benefit. Why challenge a belief that keeps you alive and profitable elsewhere? Notice how different this is from terror through violence. Violence invites escalation. It dares challengers to prove themselves. Quiet deterrence offers nothing to prove against. That's why this worked. The Sami never asked Vikings to respect boundaries. Boundaries emerged organically from repeated hesitation. That's far more stable than borders enforced by force. And here's the subtle brilliance, even when understanding grew later, even when myths softened, the behavior didn't fully reverse. Routes stayed the same. Ambition stayed redirected. Once people adapt around fear, they rarely undo those adaptations unless there's strong incentive. There never was. So the shield held not because it was perfect, but because it was sufficient. As your breathing remains slow and even, let that idea settle. Not all power looks impressive. Some power just makes conflict feel unnecessary. And unnecessary conflict is the kind most cultures never bother starting. That's why this story isn't about a battle that was won. It's about a battle that never needed to be fought. Eventually, Even the sharpest fears dull not because they were wrong, but because the world changes around them. Maps improve, instruments get better, knowledge spreads sideways instead of traveling only by story. What once felt unknowable becomes measurable, if not fully understood. And slowly, almost politely, terror gives way to familiarity. Not comfort, just familiarity. Vikings and later the cultures that replaced them began to name things more precisely. Coastlines grew clearer, seasons were charted, routes that once felt cursed became merely difficult. The unknown shrank, as it always does, not through bravery but through repetition. And with that, the fear lost its teeth. But here's the part people often miss. The fear didn't vanish. It thinned, like fog after sunrise, still present in low places, still clinging to edges, but no longer blocking the entire view. Northern lands became less mythic and more logistical. Travel required preparation rather than prayer. Encounters required etiquette rather than avoidance. Stories softened, losing their sharper warnings but keeping a tone of respect. You can hear it in how later accounts speak. Less of curses, less of magic, more of difficult, remote, unforgiving. Language shifts from awe to assessment, and yet even then no rush followed. There was no sudden scramble to conquer what had once been feared. No gold rush northward. No great corrective campaign to reclaim what had supposedly been lost to superstition. Because the core calculation hadn't changed. The land was still demanding. The rewards were still modest. The people were still uninterested in being absorbed. So ambition stayed pointed elsewhere. This is where the quiet success of the Sami becomes clear. They didn't need fear to last forever. They only needed it to last long enough for patterns to settle, for avoidance to become habit, for disinterest to replace desire. Once desire fades, conquest rarely follows. There's a scholarly observation worth lingering on here. Regions long perceived as marginal often remain marginal even after myths fade, because infrastructure, habit, and attention have already moved on. History doesn't double back just to correct its misunderstandings. The North remained the North, and that continuity mattered. As fear faded, respect lingered. Even stripped of myth, Sami knowledge retained quiet authority. Their methods still worked. Their relationship with the land still produced results outsiders struggled to replicate easily. So instead of erasure, something subtler happened. Coexistence, uneven, imperfect, sometimes tense but present. The terror that once stopped Vikings in their tracks had already done its most important work. It had bought time. And time, in human history, is often the difference between being overwhelmed and being allowed to continue. As your breathing stays steady, notice how this section doesn't resolve anything cleanly. That's intentional. History rarely offers neat endings. It offers transitions. Fear becomes caution. Caution becomes habit. Habit becomes landscape. And landscapes, once formed, don't ask permission to exist. Long after the ships stop turning back. Long after the drums are whispered about instead of feared, something remains. A nicho. You can hear it in stories told half seriously, in jokes that don't quite land, in the way people still lower their voices when talking about certain places, even when they insist they don't believe in old myths anymore. That's how fear survives modernization. Not as terror, but as tone. Scandinavia doesn't forget easily. Landscapes. Remember what people once felt there. Forests. Keep reputations long after explanations arrive. And the North, even as it becomes mapped and measured, never fully sheds its old gravity. Later generations don't say, "Don't go there." They say it's different up there, different weather, different people, different rhythm, and difference once established doesn't need justification. There's a subtle comparison worth noticing. Other feared places in history, swamps, deserts, seas lost their menace once technology improved. Ships got stronger, roads got better, weapons got louder, fear evaporated. But here, something lingered, not because danger remained, but because autonomy did. The Sami weren't absorbed completely. Their culture bent, adapted, resisted quietly, survived, and survival itself became part of the unease. People expect fear to end in conquest or collapse. When neither happens, the story feels unfinished, so it keeps being told. There's a scholarly phrase that fits gently here: cultural afterimage. It means impressions that persist even after their original causes fade. Like staring at a bright shape and then closing your eyes, the shape remains faint but unmistakable. That's what Viking fear became. Not belief, not doctrine, just a lingering outline. You can see it in modern fascination, documentaries, articles, late-night conversations about ancient magic and northern secrets. Even now, people are drawn to the idea that someone once lived so well in harshness that outsiders mistook competence for sorcery. And notice the tone of that fascination. It isn't mocking, it isn't dismissive. It's curious, almost respectful. Fear has softened into admiration. The Sami are no longer framed as terrifying, but as mysterious in a way that invites learning rather than avoidance. That shift matters. It shows how fear, given time, can evolve into something more generous. But the old instinct hasn't vanished entirely. Even now, people approach the North expecting it to teach them something, to challenge assumptions, to resist simplification. That expectation is inherited from centuries of stories where the land didn't behave and the people didn't explain themselves. As your breathing stays slow, feel how this part of the story becomes quieter, wider. No tension, no warning, just continuity. The terror that once haunted Vikings didn't end with screams or victories. It dissolved into memory. And memory, when shared carefully across generations, becomes identity rather than fear. By now, the story has shifted from history into reflection, and that's exactly where it belongs. Because what frightened the Vikings here wasn't unique. It rhymes with fear in other times, other places. Whenever a powerful culture runs into something, it can't immediately translate into its own language of strength. You've seen this pattern before, even if the details change. Empires reach deserts and call them cursed. Armies enter jungles and swear the land is alive. Colonizers meet nomads and accuse them of witchcraft. Not because any of those places or people were inherently terrifying, but because they refused to behave the way power expected them to. The Vikings believed power was loud. It burned. It conquered. It left monuments. The people of the North offered a quieter version, one that didn't announce itself, didn't seek witnesses, didn't care whether outsiders understood it or not. That's unsettling to any expansionist culture. Here's a comparison that helps soften the idea. Think about how modern societies react to people who opt out, who don't chase status, who don't accumulate visibly, who don't measure success the same way. They're often described as strange, suspicious, even threatening, not because they attack the system, but because they expose its assumptions. The Sami did that to Vikings without meaning to. They showed that survival didn't require domination, that knowledge could outweigh steal, that adaptation could outperform conquest. Once that realization lands, it can't be unlearned. So Vikings didn't just fear the Sami, they feared what the Sami implied, that their way of life, for all its glory, wasn't the only way to exist successfully in a harsh world. There's a scholarly idea that circles this gently: existential threat without aggression. It means feeling challenged not by violence, but by alternative models of meaning. You don't fight that kind of threat easily. You either absorb it or avoid it. The Vikings chose avoidance, and in doing so, they accidentally preserved something rare, a culture that wasn't erased by being conquered, a land that wasn't rewritten entirely by force, a history that didn't end neatly. That's why this story still feels unfinished, because it is. It doesn't climax, it tapers, it leaves space, it refuses spectacle. Just like the people at its center, as your breathing stays slow and even, notice how calm this feels now. The fear that once drove hesitation has transformed into understanding. Not full understanding, but enough to remove urgency. The terror has been dismantled gently, piece by piece, until what remains isn't frightening at all. It's instructive, and perhaps that's the final quiet twist of the story. What once terrified Vikings to the point of retreat now offers a lesson they never had words for. That power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply endures. The night has stretched long enough now that even fear feels tired. You're no longer standing at the edge of something unknown. You're looking back at it, with distance softening the sharpest outlines. What once felt like terror now looks like a misunderstanding that lasted just long enough to matter. And that's the strange power of this story. The Vikings didn't lose here. The Sami didn't win in the way victories are usually counted. Nothing ended with fire or surrender. Instead, the world adjusted. The North remained quiet. The routes bent away. The stories grew careful. And life continued. If you trace it all the way back, the thing that terrified Vikings wasn't drums or storms or dreamwalkers. Those were symbols, not causes. The real fear was deeper and harder to name. It was the realization that their most reliable tools, force, speed, intimidation, weren't universally effective. That there were places where shouting didn't help, where charging forward wasted energy, where control created problems instead of solving them. For a culture built on decisive action, that was destabilizing. So they adapted the only way they knew how. They respected distance. They accepted uncertainty. They chose other directions. And in doing so, they allowed a different way of living to persist alongside theirs. That's why this story feels quieter than most histories. It doesn't demand applause. It doesn't end in triumph or tragedy. It settles into something rarer, mutual survival, shaped by caution. The Sami didn't need to scare the Vikings forever. They only needed to exist long enough, confidently enough, that fear turned into habit, and habit turned into restraint. As your breathing stays slow and even, feel how the tension has completely drained now. Nothing is chasing you. Nothing needs proving. The land has gone still again, not because it's empty, but because it's at peace with being misunderstood. This is where the story naturally rests, not with answers shouted into the dark, but with understanding that doesn't need to speak at all. Now let the images loosen and fade. The forest no longer watches. The wind no longer carries meaning. The night becomes just night again. You don't need to hold the whole story anymore. You've already followed it from fear to familiarity, from misunderstanding to quiet respect. There's nothing left to resolve, nothing left to guard against. Imagine the land settling back into itself, snow smoothing over footprints, smoke thinning into the cold air, sounds growing farther apart until silence feels gentle instead of heavy. The Vikings sail on, choosing other horizons. The Sami continue on, moving with seasons that don't need witnesses, and the world, unbothered, keeps turning. History often tells us who conquered whom, who shouted loudest, who left the biggest marks. But sometimes the most important stories are about restraint, about moments when people didn't push, didn't force, didn't need to win. This was one of those moments. You can let your thoughts slow now. Let the edges of the story blur. Nothing here requires your attention anymore. The lesson has already settled, where lessons like this belong not in urgency, but in calm. Feel the quiet stretch comfortably around you. No storms, no drums, no fear, just rest. Sweet dreams.